This Trick Will Kill You by Jack Olick. Narrated by Chris Harvey.
What a preposterous story.
Critchett brushed an imaginary speck of lint from his sleeve. Throughout Maitland's recital, he had sat with his lips pursed, and there was more than a hint of derision in his voice when he spoke.
A preposterous plan. A preposterous story.
Maitland, still held fast by the horror of his own tale, looked through him rather than at him. His eyes wide with lingering recollection, he blinked rapidly as if to blink away the terrible pictures that persisted in his memory.
And yet it seems so real.
He barely whispered it.
Almost as if
Critchett's contemptuous smile was lost upon him. If he heard when Critchett said,
almost as if you were actually going to do it.
He chose to ignore the question. The others, when it became obvious that there would be no reply, settled back in their chairs. Only the actor showed an unwillingness to let the matter drop.
I know the feeling, he said. I've had it often with...
He too fell silent, his stare vague and his drink forgotten in his hand, and Critchett leaned forward impatiently.
What?
The actor let his stare move across the faces that watched him so intently.
All right, I'll tell you.
His eyes, no longer vague, came into focus, but not on the faces. It was as if he were staring across time and space at something that only he could see. Almost any man other than Sebastian, after having travelled thousands of miles to see it, would have been delighted by the bazaar. It was a constantly changing kaleidoscope of sound and colour. Except for a sprinkling of well-dressed tourists, it might have been a scene from the Arabian Nights, complete even to the Hindu fakir, about whom a small crowd was gathering as he prepared for his performance. Bullock-drawn carts, brown-skinned men in turbans, sari-clad women, hawkers, fortune-tellers, they were all there, and all, to Sebastian, were a source of irritation. Calcutta in midsummer is a sweatbox, a dank, evil-smelling sinkhole. Just the short walk across the cobbled square from the hotel where he and Inez were staying had been enough to drench him in perspiration and shorten his temper, so that his eyes, as he stared at the crowd who watched the fakir, were hostile, and his lips curled into a contemptuous smile that was half a sneer. Fools! Were they really so ignorant that they did not know that magic was no more than illusion, that all magic, even his own, was merely clever trickery? Still, himself a performer, he could not resist a performance. Drawing Inez along behind him, he pushed his way through the sweating mob until he had a clear view of the fakir and his entourage. What he saw served only to deepen his contempt. Western audiences demanded spangles, glitter, glamour. That was Inez's function. She was not only his wife but his assistant. But here the audience was far more easily satisfied. The fakir, turbaned and swathed in a voluminous robe, his wizened old face hidden behind a grey beard and his feet bare, stood before a huge circular wicker basket. On the cobbles by the basket lay a chipped and battered sword and an equally chipped and battered long-bladed dagger. Behind him, a Hindu girl of perhaps 20 squatted cross-legged, her toes protruding from under her skirts, and played on what looked to be a homemade reed pipe. That was all. No props, no spangles, no glitter. Only the fakir, the basket, the girl, and the thin, nerve-rasping music. "Not exactly ready for top billing, are they?" Sebastian said. Inez, brassily pretty despite the humidity that had already wilted her dress, was as contemptuous as he. "Hardly." The crowd, however, did not seem to share their contempt. Far from it. Eager, they jostled each other in their efforts to move closer to the fakir until, with a wave of one thin arm, he brought them to attention. Standing so with one arm raised and his other hand on the closed lid of the wicker basket, he waited until the crowd was silent, and even Sebastian had to admit, however grudgingly, that the old man knew his trade. No act, not even the most skilled, could hope to succeed unless it had the full attention of its audience, and the fakir certainly had that. Still with his hand resting on the lid of the basket, he stepped behind it so that the basket was between him and the crowd, and spoke in spaced, careful tones. "I have before me a magic basket, blessed by the gods of the temple." It was a good beginning, provocative, and Sebastian nodded. "I open the basket." The fakir suited his actions to the words, raised the lid. Bent over the basket, he called loudly, "Akbar!" Disgusted again, Sebastian snorted. Not the old basket trick, surely. He had just for a moment hoped for something more, perhaps even something new, but he should have known. From somewhere in the crowd a small boy appeared and approached the basket, his eyes too old and too wise for his 10-year-old face as the fakir placed a brown hand on his head. His own head thrown back as if in the beginnings of a trance, the fakir again stood motionless, testing the interest of the crowd, and found it to his liking. "I give you my blessing. May the gods of the temple protect you from all danger." Perspiration was trickling down Sebastian's back. His shirt was wet with it. Damn! It was the old basket trick after all. 10,000 miles for this. His anger with the fakir, with the heat, with his own discomfort, etched thin lines in his forehead. Yet even then he stayed. Well, one never knew. Slowly, as he had obviously been taught, the boy lifted one leg and then the other over the lip of the basket and stood inside it. A pause for effect, and then he was sinking down, gathering in upon himself, crouching until the top of his head was no longer visible. The lid, equipped with a metal ring that matched another ring on the side of the basket, slammed down on him. From somewhere, even Sebastian did not see from where, the fakir produced a rusty padlock, slipped its bar through the two rings, snapped it shut, and then tugged at the basket lid to prove that it had really been locked in place. "And now," the fakir did not complete the sentence. Still keeping the basket between himself and the onlookers, he took up the chipped sword, held it up before him with both hands, and let his eyes travel along its length to its tip. The eyes of the crowd, Sebastian's and Inez's among them, followed involuntarily, and then snapped downward as the fakir suddenly turned the sword so that its tip was poised directly above the basket. "Pray for the soul of the one within." The sword thrust down in a straight line, pierced the basket, plunged on, and the crowd gasped in horror as a shriek of mortal agony answered its passage. Tourists and natives all stood suddenly frozen, all but Sebastian and Inez. Inez, amused, smiled. Sebastian, though he was not aware of it, looked angry, pat upon. The stupid horror of the crowd as the fakir withdrew his sword from the basket only deepened his scowl. The sword was covered with blood. Blood indeed. And they were all properly impressed. His audiences were not so simple. They constantly demanded something new, something different. Again and again the fakir plunged his sword into the basket, piercing it at a dozen angles, and then tossed the sword aside with a theatrical carelessness and opened the basket with a key that he took from under his robe. Drawing the action out so that it took as long as possible, he opened the basket. Instantly, the boy Akbar leaped to his feet and waved his arms to indicate that he was unhurt. The gods be praised for this miracle. The fakir, his own arms raised skyward in thanks, waited. Now, surely the audience would jeer. Sebastian was certain of it. He was disappointed. The burst of applause that followed was heartfelt, sincere. The idiots. Akbar had leapt from the basket and was vanishing into the crowd, but the performance was not over. Again the fakir stopped, and this time came erect with the long-bladed dagger gleaming dully in his fist. Deliberately again, dragging out every moment, he lifted the dagger to his bearded cheek with one hand. Fascinated, the crowd watched as he pressed its point against his flesh. The point entered the skin, vanished, and as it did so, his other hand came up so that for an instant his face was hidden. When he took his hands away, the dagger remained. The dagger had pierced both his cheeks. Its tip protruded from one side of his face, its hilt from the other. "A trick!" Someone in the crowd at least was not an utter fool. Sebastian's eyes mirrored his satisfaction. But the fakir had not yet done. His head shook slowly in denial, and his lips parted, opened wide. In the glaring sunlight, the inside of his mouth was clearly visible. The shaft of the dagger's blade, incongruous between his blackened teeth, was there for all to see. "No trick, and no pain. The power of yoga." The fakir's words were indistinct, obscured by the metal that skewered his cheeks from one side to the other, but still understandable. But it was too much. Sebastian's grunt was the very acme of pure disgust. Miserable, uncomfortable, disappointed, he could stand no more. There was no real reason other than his own pettiness and irritation for what he did then, but he had had enough. Moving quickly, he stepped forward, grasped the tip of the dagger with one hand and its hilt with the other, and pulled. The dagger came away in his grasp, except, of course, that it was not a dagger at all, but merely a handle with a blade that had reached only as far as the fakir's cheek and then bent away into a U-shape that had been concealed by his beard. The other end of the U, the point that had seemed to protrude from his opposite cheek, was simply a continuation of the curve. Only the fakir's gasp of astonishment was needed in order for Sebastian to go on to the completion of his revelation. As the old man's mouth opened, Sebastian's long magician's fingers reached between his parted lips and came away with the bit of steel that the Hindu had placed there when he brought both hands to his face. The blade of the dagger. Sebastian raised the ridiculous prop high, so that even the watchers at the far rear of the audience could see it. "He has the real dagger up his sleeve." The mutterings that answered him were a pleasing reward, but it was still not enough. Disregarding the fakir as though he were not there, he tossed the fake dagger aside and bent over the wicker basket, punching at its walls from inside. At the first impact, a double door at the rear of the basket swung open. Akbar, even the slowest of the crowd could see at once, had never been in any danger. He had not even been in the basket when the sword thrust through it. All that had been required of him was that he escape through the trapdoor and so into hiding beneath the fakir's flowing robe before the basket was pierced. Sebastian's voice dripped with sarcasm. "No gods, no supernatural powers, no yoga. Just tricks. As a fellow magician, I can assure you of that." The muttering of the crowd faded, changed. Gradually, the muttering became laughter. The crowd had gathered to be entertained, and entertained they had been. But none, as they turned away from the fakir, tossed at his feet the small coins that would ordinarily have been his reward. For a moment, he and Sebastian looked into each other's eyes. Then the fakir's eyes dropped. Shamed, he hung his head and did not look up as Sebastian took Inez's arm and followed the crowd. Neither of them, as they left, looked back, and so they did not see the Indian girl who still squatted on the cobblestones, her flute silent in her lap. and glared after them. Her eyes, unlike the fakir's, were not obscured by shame. They were wide, hot, blazing with hatred. Nor would it have mattered to Sebastian and Inez if they had looked back. The girl was hardly of any importance to either of them. Inez, in fact, was laughing. She and Sebastian were two of a kind, and she understood perfectly what had motivated him. Magic, after all, was their business, and it would not do to have that business degraded, even in this god-forsaken country, even if their bookings had been few and far between of late. Besides, Sebastian had already forgotten the fakir. His handkerchief in hand, he was mopping his damp face when they entered their hotel room a few minutes later. If he had forgotten the fakir, he had not forgotten his discomfort. The look that he gave the barely rotating ceiling fan was proof of that. "Whew, it's hot. That fan doesn't seem to do much good, does it?" "No, not much." Inez was considering. Their time in India thus far had hardly been a rousing success. "Look, why don't we pack up and go home? We wanted to see the land of ancient mystery. Well, we've seen it, haven't we? And there isn't a mystery in sight. Not even a new trick for our act. How about it?" Sebastian too considered. Inez was right, of course. Their trip had been a disaster. Still, a hint of the stubbornness that was an inherent part of his nature was still visible in the set of his lips when he spoke again. "Let's give it another day or two. Who knows what tomorrow may bring?" Inez did not insist. "If you say so." Hard and brittle as she was, Sebastian could be even harder when he felt mean, and the heat had made him mean. It was obvious. "I think I'll take a shower." Sebastian hardly heard her. For the rest of what remained of the afternoon, he maintained a dour silence, lost in his own thoughts, and that night tossed and turned restlessly as he lay beside her. Somewhere there had to be something that he could use, some trick that would add novelty to the act that he and Inez had performed for so long and that had, at last, gone stale from overexposure. One new trick was all that they needed, something spectacular, and they would be at the top of the heap again. It was that thought that drove him from the hotel and back into the square again the next morning, while Inez still slept. Even knowing that it was hopeless, he still had to try. A coursing dog following a faint and all but hopeless trail, he stepped into the glare of another steaming, impossibly bright day and halted, frustrated. The square was empty except for those few shoppers who had risen as early as he and were already removing the shutters from the dingy cubicles in which they conducted their business. He would have to seek elsewhere. Calcutta, Lord knew, did not lack for bazaars. Cursing the heat as always, he strolled across the square, not heading in any particular direction, and at the spot where he had confronted the fakir the day before, chuckled sourly before moving on. But he had gone scarcely 100 yards before he again came to a halt. To his left was the mouth of a street that was little more than an alley, and from the alley he could hear a familiar sound. Someone was playing an Indian tune on a reed pipe, and the music drew him to the alley and into it. The fakir again? Curious, he walked between crude stone-wall buildings that seemed to lean inward, so that the sunlight was shut out, and it was as if he had suddenly stepped from day into night. Refuge and the offal of animals was everywhere, and his nostrils wrinkled in distaste. But even so he went on, until, in time, he realized that he was in a cul-de-sac. Ahead, where practically no light at all could enter, there was a wall that cut off further progress. He did not at first see the girl seated before the wall, but when he did, he recognized her at once. He had the day before given her hardly a glance, but there was no mistaking her. Squatting cross-legged with her bare feet showing from under the edges of her skirts, her pipe to her lips, she was exactly as she had been. There was even a wicker basket, a smaller replica of the one the fakir had used, open in front of her. The girl did not look up as he approached. Her eyes fixed on the open basket, she continued to make her rasping, unpleasant music as he bent to look into it. Inside the basket there was a coil of thick yellow rope, and for a moment he had the uncanny impression that the coils were moving, writhing slowly as if in time with the music. Startled, he drew in his breath and then stared, fascinated. The music of the pipe had become almost strident. It rose higher and higher, and as it did, so the tip of the rope lifted like the head of a snake and left the basket. Still in time with the music, it rose until at least 3 feet of its length were stiffly upright. Sebastian could not take his eyes away. He had heard of the famous Indian rope trick, of course, but he had never seen it performed. The rope trick was a myth, a fable, and yet even as he watched, the rope continued its ascent, climbed until it stood like a steel rod, and he could see its top only by tilting his head back until he was looking straight up. Sudden silence brought his eyes back to the girl. She had stopped playing just at that instant when the rope reached its full height, and as he watched, she set down her pipe and walked to the basket. Still not looking at Sebastian, she grasped the rope and effortlessly, easily pulled herself up, hand over hand, until she was high above and looking down at him. Sebastian was impressed. Stare as he would, he could detect no mechanical device, no wires, nothing to explain what he had just seen. "All right, what's the trick?" This time there was no contempt in his voice. The girl, if she understood him at all, did not answer. Her only reply was to return his stare, steadily, for a moment, before sliding back down the rope. Silent, she returned to her place by the wall, squatted again and clapped her hands. At the sound, the rope collapsed into its basket. Amazement, cupidity, and cunning flickered across Sebastian's eyes and were gone. What he had seen was fantastic, but it would not do to let the girl know that he thought so. These natives, when they smelled a profit, could be as greedy as any Westerner. Casually, almost negligently, he pointed to the basket as if asking permission to examine it. The girl smiled, nodded, and if her smile was not warm, he did not notice. The girl did not interest him. The rope did. But the rope, when he had picked it up and examined every inch of it, told him nothing. It was a thick, hempen rope, no more. Nor did the basket which had contained it serve to dispel his deepening frown of puzzlement. The basket contained no mechanism of any kind. One could purchase 100 just like it at any bazaar. "Okay, how much?" There was no other way. For answer, the girl tilted her head questioningly. "How much do you want for the trick? Name your price." The girl's head moved slowly from side to side. She did understand him then. "There is no trick. The magic is in the rope." Magic! That brought the curl back to his lips, but he had expected something of the sort. Anything to raise the price, eh? "Then sell me the rope." "I cannot." He could barely see the girl's face in the gloom of the alley, but it seemed to him that her eyes glowed like an animal's. "It was my mother's, and her mother, and 40,000 rupees." Sebastian was in no mood for history. The sum he had named, to a barefoot and probably illiterate native, was a fortune. She would have to accept. "It is not for sale, not at any price." There was no mistaking the finality of the girl's voice. There would be no more bargaining. He had been prepared to offer 50,000 rupees, even more if necessary. Instead, his jaw set hard as he glared at her. Wordless with rage, he turned on his heel and walked back the way he had come. Inez, when he told her about the girl later, was as impressed as he had been. Sebastian had few peers in the profession, and if he had been impressed by the trick, there was no question but that it was remarkable. For hours they spoke of nothing else, and when he fell again into one of his dour silences, she left him alone. If there was a way to obtain the trick, he would find it, and as greedy as he, she waited. By nightfall he had made up his mind. He had been drinking steadily, and his face was flushed when he finally turned to her, another drink in his hand, and said, for perhaps the 20th time, "Look, I'm sure it's a trick, but I examined the rope and the basket, and I couldn't see how it was rigged, and she wouldn't sell it." The question was superfluous. Sebastian had already repeated his story over and over again, but it was something to say. He did not seem to hear her. As though he had forgotten her, he turned to stare out of the window at the square and, as she watched him, took a huge swallow from his drink. "Look, if I couldn't figure out how it worked, no one else will be able to. It'll be a sensation. We've got to get it. So, we're going to get it. Without it, we'll be playing one-night stands for the rest of our lives." He had spoken with his back to her. When he turned again to face her, there was a question in his eyes. What he had in mind would involve risk, but he need not have been concerned. The rapport between him and Inez was, always had been, a true meeting of minds. Her enamelled prettiness had about it the dangerous grace of a panther as she leaned toward him. So, if we're going to get our hands on the trick, we can't be too choosy about how we go about it. Agreed? She understood him perfectly. Agreed. Just tell me what I have to do. He told her, and when he had done, she did not recoil. There was really no choice. Not for two people to whom money and success meant everything. In the morning, he left her alone in their room when he returned to the alley where he had spoken to the girl, and the girl was there. The girl, when he had entered the alley and walked its odorous length, was sitting cross-legged by the wall almost as if she had never left it, and her head did not come up until he stood directly in front of her. Sebastian half expected, if he found her at all, to find her playing on her pipe. Instead, the pipe lay in her lap, but the basket that contained the rope was beside her. That was the important thing. "The trick you showed me yesterday," he began. "No trick," the girl's head wagged vigorously. The magic that you showed me yesterday, then. I told my wife about it. She wondered if you could show it to her." Everything depended upon the girl's reply, yet he managed to make what he said sound fairly casual. "Will you?" The girl waved toward the basket. "Gladly. I am always here." No, my wife is ill. We wondered if you could come to our hotel room." Again the girl shook her head. "I'll pay you 200 rupees just to show it to her." She had to say yes. The word that rose to Sebastian's lips was one that he rarely used. "Please." It must have been the word that did it. It hung between them as they looked into each other's eyes. Then the girl nodded. Moving with the almost feline ease that seemed to distinguish so many Indian women, she rose to her feet and, when she had tucked the flute under the fold in her sari, stooped to pick up her basket. Together they left the alley. Inez, waiting by the window of the hotel room, could see them as they crossed the square. the girl dwarfed by Sebastian's western height. She and Sebastian had started the day with tall glasses of gin and tonic, neglecting breakfast, and she still held her glass as she left the window. Before setting it down, she emptied it at a gulp. The next few moments would not be pleasant, but, she shrugged, they would be necessary. By the time Sebastian's knock sounded at the door, she was in bed, a light coverlet hiding her dressing gown.
Come in.
The Indian girl entered first. Sebastian, a step behind her, was the perfect model of a concerned husband as he pressed a chaste kiss to Inez's forehead. "This is Inez, my wife." The girl bowed slightly from the waist, palms together in the traditional Hindu greeting.
"I am very sorry that you are ill."
She had set her basket down on the floor. Not waiting for a reply, she seated herself beside it, produced her pipe, and began to play the same discordant tune that both Inez and Sebastian had heard before. At the first note, the rope began its slow rise into the air. Inez's eyes widened, but the warning finger that Sebastian placed to his lips silenced her gasp before it was voiced. Moving carefully and keeping his eyes glued to the Indian girl's back, he reached behind the chair that stood by the bed. His hand, when he brought it back into view, held a long Indian sword, very much like the one that the fakir had used as a prop. Intent on her music, the girl did not see or hear him as he moved toward her. The rope had already climbed half its length toward the ceiling, and she had eyes for nothing else. Sebastian's face was a grim mask. Delicately, setting one foot before the other as though dancing a ballet, he moved closer, closer still, until he was directly behind her. His thrust, when he lunged forward, drove the sword completely through the girl. He could feel it grate against bone, twist in his hand as she half rose, her head jerking back and her mouth gaping open. Had it not been for the blade that transfixed her, protruding a good 12 inches from her breast, she would have toppled sideways, but that did not happen until Sebastian, yanking viciously, pulled the sword from her body. As he did so, she fell. In the same instant, the rope went slack, dropped back into its basket. This time, despite herself, Inez could not choke back the gasp that escaped her. "Be still." Sebastian, after a first moment of revulsion, was in complete control of himself. Bent over, he was already grasping the girl's body by the shoulders, dragging her toward the closet at the other side of the room. Nor was Inez far behind. Before he had reached the closet, she was already there. Inside the closet there was a steamer trunk. She was fumbling with the trunk's clasps by the time he had dragged the corpse close. "We'll put her in there later." Sebastian was eager. "Let's see what the trick is first." Heaving, he dumped the girl's limp weight on top of the trunk, found the sword and threw that in after her, and closed the closet door. Neither he nor Inez gave the closet a second glance. Both had their eyes fixed on the basket. "She said the trick was in the rope." Sebastian was moving toward the basket as he spoke. For perhaps 10 minutes after they had pulled the rope from its container, they felt of it, coiled and uncoiled it, explored it with their fingers. Inez was the first to give up. Disappointment made her voice almost a sob. "It isn't hollow. There's no wire in it. There's nothing. Nothing." "There's got to be." Sebastian's answering voice was savage. Again, beginning at one end of it and working his way to the other, he examined the rope. Nothing. But that wasn't possible. There had to be something with it. Wait a minute. His heel, as he turned Inez, had brushed against something. The Indian girl's pipe, lying where it had fallen from her dead hands. Her flute.
"Her flute? You think that might be the answer? Oh, you can't be serious."
"What can you think of another answer? It's at least worth a try." His viciousness silenced her. The pipe in his hand, he seated himself on the floor and crossed his legs, imitating the Indian girl's position as closely as he could and feeling like a fool. But there was no other way. The flute had to be the key. Tentatively, his fingers placed haphazardly on the stops, he put the pipe to his mouth and blew into it. At once, the rope began to stir. The notes he blew were nerve-wracking, completely without relationship to each other, but they confirmed what he had not really dared to hope for. The tip of the rope rose, writhed higher and higher, until, incredibly, the rope hung suspended in mid-air, the tip of it touching the ceiling, the rest of it still writhing, snake-like. Gasping, Sebastian paused for breath. "Keep playing!" Again he blew into the pipe, higher notes this time. The rope stiffened, went rigid. When he took his mouth from the pipe, it remained upright, unmoving. "We've done it!" Inez was almost dancing with excitement. In her mind's eye, she was already seeing the audiences of the future, audiences amazed, mystified, applauding deliriously. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dressing gown, flung the gown aside. And now, just as it will be in our act, lithe and eager in bra and panties, she made an attractive picture as she tugged at the rope, testing it. "It holds me! I can climb it!" Her eyes were shining. Not waiting for his approval, she began to climb. "No, wait!" Sebastian on his feet was troubled and did not know why. It was all too simple, too easy. "Wait? Wait for what?" Nothing. Go ahead." His own eyes were as eager as hers as she continued to climb. Inez pulled herself higher, and because of that, because he was below and she was looking upward at the ceiling, he did not see what she saw, did not see her sudden expression of pain or the look of stark horror that contorted her face, that twisted it into a caricature of her usual prettiness. "Sebastian! Sebastian!" So much he heard and understood. The rest was a terrifying scream that burst from her lips and echoed from the walls and left him gaping up at the rope incredulously, and then with a horror that matched the twisted expression that had distorted in his face just before she screamed. Inez was gone, vanished, obliterated. Only the rope still stood, its tip touching the ceiling. "Inez! Inez! Inez, where are you?" His shout died on his lips. Just above the tip of the rope, the white ceiling had suddenly darkened. Even as he stared, a red stain spread across the ceiling until it made a small circle. A wet circle that gave birth to a thick liquid that flowed toward the centre of the circle and then dripped, drop by crimson drop, onto the floor below. A pool of blood, it was blood, there was no mistaking it, began to form at his feet. Terrified, he watched the pool grow. Every instinct that he possessed was shrieking, warning him to run, to get out, and still he remained. It was only the light touch of something against his cheek that awakened him from his near trance at last. The rope! The rope was no longer rigidly upright. It had bent down upon itself, as though alive. It was swaying, reaching for him. Completely in the grip of panic, he leapt back, raced to the door, grasped at the door handle, and the rope whipped down, lashed across his wrist, so that he too howled with pain. It was alive. It came after him as he fled to the window, coiling and uncoiling itself, forcing him to climb over the bed in his frantic efforts to escape. And at the other side of the bed, it was waiting for him there. He fainted, made a pretense of climbing back across the bed to the door, and the rope was ahead of him, lashing at him, forcing him to dodge, heading him back.
Back! Back! There was no other way he could go. The rope was everywhere, lunging as though it were a sentient, intelligent thing, a diabolical thing, a thing that gave him no respite until he stood, finally, with his back to the door of the closet. Then, as if satisfied, the rope hovered, still for just an instant, and in that instant the door of the closet swung open, and the corpse of the Indian girl fell from where he had thrown it and struck the backs of his legs, distracting him. He half turned, looked down. That was when the rope caught him. It struck suddenly, looping itself around his neck and drawing tight so that his shriek of fear was cut off, strangled. He fought, of course. He fought madly, insanely, but there was no escape from that incredible pressure around his throat. Presently, suffused with blood, his face began to turn black. His eyes protruded from their sockets. His hands, gripped tightly around the yellow hemp that was choking life from him, fell away. He could no longer feel, no longer think. Only just before the end was there a last faint gleam of light in his eyes. Just before the end, his numbed brain flickered for the last time. He thought of the Indian girl, of the fakir. There was no such thing as true magic. All magic was a trick, an illusion. Even this, what was happening to him, was an illusion. It had to be. There could be no other explanation, no other answer. So he thought, and thinking it, died. And that was a pity, because if he had been alive, if he had been able to walk again in the bazaar only a few minutes later, he might have found the real answer. Had he walked in the bazaar, he might have seen the tourists and the brown-skinned men and the sari-clad women gathering again around the fakir in his flowing robe, as the old man opened his basket and said, "I have before me a magic basket blessed by the gods of the temple. I open it." He might have seen the fakir raise his eyes until they were looking directly at the window of the room in which he still lay, and where the rope still hung in mid-air, still swayed gently. He might, most importantly, have seen what happened when the fakir called "Akbar," and a small boy ran from the crowd to take his place in the basket. Because just after he intoned his formula, "I give you my blessing, may the gods protect you from all danger," the fakir turned for a moment to smile at someone who squatted on the cobblestones behind him. Someone whose bare toes poked out from under the edges of her skirts and whose sari showed no signs of blood, no rents or tears such as might have been made by the passage of a sword through her body. Someone, an Indian girl of perhaps 20, who smiled back at the fakir and then lifted what looked to be a homemade native pipe to her lips and began to play a harsh, discordant Indian tune. Sebastian's eyes were still focused on infinity, on something that only he could see, and that something, a vision, a premonition, whatever it was, had frozen him in his seat. A man condemned to death might have sat so, and the others, respecting what he must be feeling, said nothing, except again for Critchett. Critchett, his contemptuous smile still playing about his lips, did not share the consideration. "You look as if you've seen a ghost," he said, and somehow made the words insulting. "There are no such things as ghosts, except in magicians' illusions." Sebastian, speaking more to himself than to Critchett, completely missed Critchett's smile, but the artist did not. The artist, when Critchett turned to him and said, "And you?" regarded Critchett coldly. Well, you're the one who started all this, so why not yours first?
My what?
Critchett, taken aback, pretended puzzlement. But there was no mistaking the challenge that the artist flung at him. A dream? Phobia? Obsession? Fear? Whatever you want to call it. Critchett's laugh was strained, but it died away as he became aware of the questioning stares that were being directed at him by the others.
Oh, my fear is very strange indeed.
The words, sneeringly spoken, were intended to dismiss the artist's challenge, and they failed. The others still waited expectantly. In the face of their expectations, he had no choice, and despite himself, he could not suppress a small shudder as he too remembered.
Strange. Strange. Yes, very strange,
he repeated.
But all so real. It's just so real.
Sebastian's story, This Trick'll Kill You, was written by Jack Olek and narrated, sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming very soon, stay tuned for even more tales from the chilling depths of the Vault of Horror, from where I will be bringing you Arthur Critchett's fateful story, The Neat Job. And are you neat and tidy? Well, I think it is safe to say that the subject of our next tale, Mr. Critchett, is indeed exceedingly neat and tidy to the point of complete and utter obsession, and a very unhealthy and indeed somewhat aggressive obsession it seems to be, too. Oh, heaven help the poor woman who ever agrees to marry him. Oh, poor, poor little Eleanor. Heaven help you. What have you done?